The Arizona sun hung low in the sky, blazing like fire over the dusty town of Copper Springs. Heat shimmered above the wooden platform as the train screeched to a halt, sending clouds of steam and dust into the air. Passengers stepped down one by one, eager to escape the cramped cars. Among them was a young woman in a faded blue calico dress, her gloved hand gripping the railing as she carefully descended the steps. Her name was Eliza Turner, and she had traveled more than 1,000 miles from Ohio to begin a new life. In her pocket rested a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, each written by the man she was meant to marry. Harlan Cobb had promised her a home, a partnership, and a future in the Arizona Territory. He had written that he wanted a hard-working wife, not beauty or wealth. Eliza had believed him. She had believed every word. But as her boots touched the wooden platform, her heart pounded with a quiet fear she could not explain. The heat pressed down on her shoulders, and she paused for a moment, steadying herself before stepping forward. Her left leg dragged slightly behind the other, a reminder of an old injury that had shaped her life since childhood. She had learned to walk with dignity, to hide the pain behind steady determination. But she knew people always noticed. She scanned the faces waiting at the edge of the platform, families reunited with joyful embraces, travelers greeted by friends, and strangers rushing toward their next destination. Then she saw him. A tall, broad man stood beside a buckboard wagon, his hat tilted back, and a thick mustache curled neatly at the ends, and he matched the photograph she carried in her pocket. Harlan Cobb. Eliza raised her hand in a small wave and began walking toward him, her trunk left behind on the platform. For a moment, his eyes met hers, and hope flickered in her chest. But as she took another step, the uneven rhythm of her walk became clear. His expression changed. The warmth vanished, replaced by something cold and distant. He looked down at her limp, then back at her face. Without a word, he shook his head. Just once. A quiet, final decision. Before Eliza could speak, he turned away, climbed onto the wagon, and snapped the reins. The horse moved forward, the wheels creaking as the buckboard rolled down the dusty street. She stood frozen, her hand still half raised, watching as the man she had traveled so far to meet disappeared around the corner without a single word. The platform grew quiet around her. Passengers drifted away, leaving Eliza alone with her trunk and her shattered expectations. The sun burned against her skin, but she did not move. Her fingers trembled as she lowered her hand and pressed it against her skirt, willing herself to stay strong. A gentle voice broke the silence. "Ma'am, are you expecting someone?" Eliza turned to see an elderly station master watching her with kind eyes. His cap was tilted forward, and his weathered face showed concern. She forced a small smile, though her throat felt tight. "I was," she replied softly. "But it seems I'm not anymore." The man nodded, understanding more than she needed to say. "That was Harlan Cobb's wagon. Well, wasn't it?" "Yes," Eliza answered. She sat slowly on her trunk, fanning herself with her bonnet. "He decided he didn't want me after all." The station master sighed, shaking his head. "That ain't right. A man ought to at least have the decency to speak his mind." "It's done," she said quietly. There was no anger in her voice, only weary acceptance. "Is there a boarding house in town?" "Widow Harmon takes boarders," he replied. 50 cents a night, meals included." Eliza opened the small purse tucked into her sleeve and counted the coins inside. $2.37, enough for a few nights and little more. She closed the purse and stood, lifting her trunk with effort. "Thank you," she said. "I'll find my way." As she walked down the dusty street, her limp more pronounced under the weight of the trunk, and she refused to look back. The town stretched before her in shades of brown and gold, its buildings weathered by sun and wind. This was not the life she had imagined, but it was the only one she had. 4 days later, with her money running low, Eliza stood at the edge of the Holloway Ranch. The land was quiet, the house weathered and worn as if it had been forgotten by the world. Shutters hung crooked. The garden was choked with weeds, and no smoke rose from the chimney. Yet something about the place stirred a quiet determination within her. She had heard about the ranch from the station master. The owner, Gideon Holloway, had fallen ill and needed help. The journey there had taken her 2 miles on foot under the relentless Arizona sun, her leg aching with every step. But she had no other choice. Eliza approached the door and knocked gently. There was no answer. She pushed it open and stepped inside, her breath catching at the sour smell of sickness that filled the room. A man lay on a cot near the far wall, his skin pale and damp with fever. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and his breathing came in shallow, uneven gasps. His arm was wrapped in filthy bandages, stained with infection. Without hesitation, Eliza set down her bag and crossed the room. She pressed her hand to his forehead and felt the burning heat of his fever. Her grandmother had taught her how to tend the sick, and she knew at once that the man was close to death. She fetched water from the well, lit a fire in the stove, and began cleaning his wound with careful hands. The man stirred, groaning softly as she worked, but he did not wake. Hours passed as she bathed his arm, replaced the bandages, and brewed willow bark tea to ease his pain. Night fell, and the small cabin glowed with the soft light of a single lamp. Eliza sat beside him, exhausted but determined, whispering softly as she tended to him through the darkness. "You're not alone," she murmured gently. "I'm here now." As the wind whispered across the desert outside, Eliza Turner kept her vigil, unaware that the broken cowboy she had saved would one day repay her kindness with a love deeper than she had ever dreamed possible. Morning light crept slowly through the thin curtains, painting soft gold across the worn wooden floor of the Holloway cabin. Eliza stirred in the chair beside the cot, her neck stiff and her body aching from days of little sleep. For a moment, she did not remember where she was, but then she felt the weight of a warm hand resting near hers and looked up. The cowboy's eyes were open. They were a clear gray-green, steady but cautious, watching her as if she were a stranger who had wandered into his world without permission. His face was pale, but the feverish flush had faded, replaced by the faint color of returning strength. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rough and weak. Eliza straightened slowly, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "My name's Eliza Turner," she replied gently. "I found you here a few days ago. You were sick. Real sick." He blinked, trying to gather his thoughts. "How long?" 3 days, she answered. "You had blood poisoning. I cleaned your wound and kept the fever down. You're through the worst of it now." He studied her carefully, his gaze dropping briefly to her uneven stance before returning to her face. There was no pity in his eyes, only quiet understanding. "You walked all this way to help a stranger?" he asked. Eliza gave a small shrug. "I had nowhere else to go, and you needed help." He nodded slowly, as if accepting this truth without question. "Name's Gideon Holloway," he said. "This is my ranch, or what's left of it." The days that followed settled into a steady rhythm. Eliza rose before dawn each morning, tending the fire and preparing simple meals from what little she found in the kitchen. She changed Gideon's bandages with careful hands, her touch gentle but firm. Slowly, his strength began to return. By the 5th day, he could sit up on his own. By the 7th, he managed a few careful steps across the room. Gideon watched her often as she worked, noticing the quiet determination in every movement. She cleaned the cabin from floor to ceiling, scrubbing away months of neglect. Dusty windows gleamed once more, and sunlight poured into the room, warming the space with new life. She washed the worn curtains and hung them to dry, their soft fabric fluttering in the desert breeze. "You don't have to do all this," he said one afternoon, leaning against the doorway as she swept the floor. Eliza paused, resting on the broom. "I know," she replied softly, "but it matters to me." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Looks different," he admitted. "Feels different, too." Beyond the cabin, she found a neglected garden struggling beneath weeds and dry soil. She spent long hours clearing the ground, coaxing life back into the earth. Tomatoes ripened under her care, and squash grew heavy on the vines. In the evenings, she cooked simple meals: warm cornbread, vegetable stew, and strong coffee. Gideon ate quietly at the table, each bite a reminder of the life slowly returning around him. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills, they sat together on the porch. The sky burned with shades of orange and crimson, and the desert air cooled at last. Gideon's gaze rested on the distant horizon, thoughtful and distant. "My sister Margaret used to sit here," he said quietly. "She passed 2 years ago. After that, I stopped caring about much of anything." Eliza listened in silence, understanding the weight behind his words. "I'm sorry," she said gently. He gave a faint nod. "You remind me of her, not in looks but in spirit." Well, she believed in fixing things, even when they seemed broken beyond repair. Eliza looked down at her hands, rough from work, but steady with purpose. "Sometimes fixing things is the only way forward," she said softly. Weeks passed, and the ranch slowly came back to life. Gideon repaired fences while Eliza tended the garden and cared for the animals. They worked side by side in quiet harmony, their shared labor building a fragile trust neither of them expected. One afternoon, while repairing the chicken coop, Gideon glanced at her with a faint smile. "You're stronger than you look," he said. Eliza laughed softly. "My grandmother used to say, 'Strength isn't measured by how we walk, but by how we keep going.'" He nodded thoughtfully. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Eliza replied. "She taught me everything I know about caring for others." Their bond deepened with each passing day, built not on grand gestures, but on small moments of understanding. They shared quiet meals, gentle laughter, and long evenings beneath the wide desert sky. Neither spoke of the future, but something unspoken grew between them, steady and undeniable. Yet the peace did not last forever. One morning, Eliza rode into Copper Springs for supplies, determined to help keep the ranch running. The town greeted her with curious stares and hushed whispers. At the mercantile, she felt the weight of judgment in every glance, especially when she recognized the cold eyes of Harlan Cobb's mother watching her with silent disapproval. The words spoken behind her back cut deep, but Eliza held her head high. She finished her errands and returned to the ranch without a tear, though her heart felt heavy with the sting of rejection once more. Gideon sensed the change in her the moment she returned. He watched her carefully as she unpacked the supplies in silence, her movements controlled, but distant. "Something happened in town," he said quietly. Eliza shook her head. "It doesn't matter." But that night, as she lay awake in Margaret's old room, the pain she had buried finally broke free. Silent tears fell as she pressed her face into the pillow, mourning the life she had lost and the uncertainty of the one she now lived. On the other side of the thin wall, Gideon lay awake as well, listening to her quiet sobs. His hands clenched at his sides, helpless against the injustice she had endured. The next day, he rode into town himself, determined to confront the whispers that had wounded her. When he returned, his face was set with quiet resolve. He found Eliza packing her belongings, her small trunk open on the floor. "I'm leaving," she said softly, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain strong. "I won't be the reason you lose everything." Gideon stepped forward, his expression firm. "You're not ruining my life, Eliza. You saved it." She shook her head, tears shining in her eyes. "I don't belong here." "You do," he said gently. "This place, it feels like home again because of you." Eliza hesitated, her hands resting on the edge of the trunk. Slowly, she closed it and set it aside, her decision made, but her heart still uncertain. "Stay," Gideon said quietly. "Not because you have nowhere else to go, Kine, but because this is where you belong." Eliza met his gaze, searching his eyes for truth. She saw no pity there, only sincerity and respect. Her heart softened, though fear still lingered in her chest. She nodded faintly, choosing to stay. For now. But neither of them yet understood how deeply their lives were about to change. The Sunday morning sun rose gently over Copper Springs, painting the desert in soft shades of gold and amber. Eliza stood before the small mirror in Margaret's old room, smoothing the folds of her faded blue dress. Her hands trembled slightly as she tied the ribbon beneath her collar. Today was the church social, and though her heart was heavy with doubt, she knew she could not hide forever. From the doorway, Gideon watched her quietly. He had shaved and pressed his white shirt, and the old string tie neatly fastened at his collar. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them was filled with unspoken fears and quiet determination. "You don't have to go," he said gently. Eliza lifted her chin. "If I run now, I'll always be running. I'm tired of being afraid." Gideon nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Then we'll face them together." They rode into town side by side, in Mr. Tatum's borrowed buckboard. The church hall stood at the end of Main Street, its white walls glowing in the sunlight. Wagons lined the yard, and the soft sound of fiddle music drifted through the open doors. Eliza's grip tightened around Gideon's arm as they stepped inside. The room fell silent. Conversations faded into whispers as every pair of eyes turned toward them. Eliza felt the weight of their stares, but felt the familiar sting of judgment, but she did not falter. Gideon's arm remained steady at her side, guiding her forward with quiet strength. They walked to the refreshment table, where lemonade and pies were laid out neatly. For a moment, no one approached them. Then the door creaked open, and Harlan Cobb strode into the hall, his presence heavy with arrogance. His mother followed closely behind, her sharp gaze fixed on Eliza. "Well," Cobb said loudly, his voice cutting through the room, "looks like the stray found herself a home after all." Eliza stiffened, but Gideon stepped forward before she could speak. His voice was calm, yet firm enough to carry across the hall. "That's enough, Cobb." The room held its breath as Gideon faced the man who had abandoned Eliza without a word. His eyes were steady, his posture unyielding. "This woman," Gideon continued, "walked 2 miles through the Arizona heat to save my life. She cared for me when I had nothing left, when even I had given up. She rebuilt my home with her own hands and brought life back to a dying ranch." A murmur spread through the crowd. Cobb's expression hardened, but Gideon did not stop. "You judged her by the way she walks," he said quietly. "But I judge her by the strength of her heart. She is worth more than any promise you ever made." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Cobb's confidence faltered under the weight of truth, and without another word, he turned and left the hall, his mother trailing behind him in silence. One by one, townsfolk began to step forward. Mr. Tatum offered a respectful nod. The schoolteacher smiled kindly, and the pastor's wife extended a warm greeting. Though not everyone welcomed her, the kindness of a few was enough to break the barrier of fear that had surrounded Eliza for so long. The fiddle music resumed, soft and inviting. Gideon turned to her, his expression gentle. "May I have this dance?" Eliza hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. As they moved slowly across the floor, she felt a peace she had never known before. The whispers faded into the background, replaced by the warmth of acceptance and the steady rhythm of the music. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they rode home beneath a sky painted with crimson and violet. The ranch appeared ahead of them, its windows glowing with lamplight and promise. Gideon guided the wagon to a stop atop the ridge overlooking the land. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a quiet and beautiful beneath the rising stars. "Eliza," he said softly, turning toward her, "I don't have much to offer. This ranch is still struggling, and the future won't be easy. But I can promise you honesty, respect, and a life built side by side." She listened, her heart steady yet full of emotion. "I never planned any of this," she admitted. "I came here expecting one life and found something entirely different. But somewhere along the way, this place became home, and you did too." Gideon reached for her hand, his calloused fingers warm and steady. "Then stay. Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you choose to." Eliza looked out at the ranch below, the garden she had revived, the house filled with light, and the quiet strength of the man beside her. Yet she thought of the train platform where she had once stood alone, abandoned and uncertain. Now she stood at the edge of a new beginning, no longer afraid. "Yes," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet certainty. "I choose to stay." Gideon's eyes softened with relief and gratitude. He drew her into a gentle embrace, holding her as the first stars shimmered overhead. In that moment, beneath the vast Arizona sky, Eliza realized she had not merely found shelter. She had found love. Together, they rode down the hill toward the ranch, where a warm light glowed from the window, welcoming them home. The future ahead would not be easy, but it would be theirs, built with courage, compassion, and the promise of a love born from kindness. And so, would the abandoned mail-order bride who had once been left behind discovered something far greater than she had ever dreamed, a home, a purpose, and a heart that would never again stand alone.